Hello, rhetorical rock stars. Welcome back for what I'm sure you're excited about, which is Rhetorical Basics Lesson 2 on syntax. As always with these lessons, they are adapted from what the College Board has told us we're required to go over for this class, AP Language and Composition. However, hopefully you find this information interesting in its own right and you don't need the College Board to tell you that you're required to do it. So let's get started. Lots of people will bring up Yoda when talking about syntax. Yoda's an easy example to use to make a certain point about syntax. So, Yoda's most famous quote is, "Try not, do or do not, there is no try." And if we're going to talk about syntax in relationship to this quote, we will notice, along with many other Yoda quotes, that he has his words in a very kind of individual, original, unique order, right? Nobody actually talks like this. So if we're looking for a simple definition of syntax, it's easy, and you may have been taught in the past that syntax is simply its word order. And to some extent that is true. But if we're going to go with a more complex understanding, then let's define it a little bit better than that. So what is syntax? Syntax is the purposeful employment of grammar and fluency in order to achieve a certain effect. So grammar and fluency, yes, word order falls under that, fluency especially. The order that we put our words in will affect our fluency. But we need to take grammar into account as well. So let's dig a little bit deeper by talking about syntax's rhetorical function. And we have this other little cartoon that I found off on the right. Same sentence, but with one difference, and you'll probably see it. The first sentence says, "Let's eat grandma," and they're getting ready to put a fork in her. And then the second sentence says, "Let's eat grandma," right? And they're looking at her like, "Come on, get to the table. We're hungry." And this, as much as word order, is a function of syntax. So if we're talking about syntax's rhetorical function, then one of its functions is to bring out or bury certain ideas. Depending on the order that you put words in, um, you can make an idea. If there's a phrase that you really want to bring attention to, then you place that phrase at a specific point in your sentence so that it's emphasized. If there's a phrase that you need to include, but you really don't want people to pay as much attention to it, you think something else in the sentence is more important, then you can place that phrase or that information somewhere else in the sentence so that readers will still read it and they'll still internalize it, or speakers will still hear it and internalize it, but it doesn't stick out to them as the most important part of that sentence. So that's one of the things that syntax can do. It can bring out or bury certain ideas. Another effect of syntax is how it affects how the audience perceives you. So if you are putting sentences together like Yoda does, in that kind of backwards style, right? You're putting your words, you're ordering your words in a way that is understandable, but also kind of offends our ear. Then there's that sense you understand that Yoda is this kind of eclectic, kind of goofy person, or puppet, I guess, from another time and another place, right? There's something different about him just from the way that his words are ordered. And in the same way, we can choose to structure sentences so that there's a more formal tone to our sentences or a less formal tone to our sentences. And it's not just about diction in that respect. It's also about how we put sentences together and how we speak them to people or how we have people read them. So the way that we structure our sentences can kind of give us a sense of sophistication or unsophistication. And our audience will pick up on that simply by how our sentences are structured grammatically. If they can add authority, right? Like if we put the really authoritative phrase at the beginning of a sentence, then that's what our audience is keying into. And so that choice of where we put a phrase can affect how our audience perceives us as an authority figure or some other kind of figure. And then the syntax can also affect our tone. You know, this is a difficult one to explain because I don't have an example sitting right in front of me. But depending on our tone and depending on our syntax, and syntax as in combination with our diction, it can either elevate our tone to that level, I guess, of sophistication and professionalism, or lower our tone to a sense of unsophistication, and that usually goes together with diction. What I'd like to also point out is that as much as this is about word order, and I've said about word order, it can also be a function of our creative or purposeful, always correct use of punctuation to achieve this function. And the cartoon over to your right is an example of that, right? Just the addition of that comma completely changes the perception of the sentence from one that's a family of cannibals who are going to eat their grandmother to one that's a family that's just maybe a little bit annoyed and urging grandma to get to the table a little bit faster so they can all have a dinner together. So word order in this case is not as important as just the punctuation. And you need to understand that syntax is largely about word order, but also importantly about how you use punctuation to achieve those same effects. So let's look at some examples. The first example, we have this sentence that says, while driving their cars, people who text are very dangerous. And that's a perfectly fine sentence. But what happens is we've got this while driving their cars phrase at the beginning. And I think probably what the person who's writing this sentence is really trying to emphasize is the danger of people who text while they're driving their cars. So a simple syntactical choice that could be made to change the emphasis of this sentence could look like this. People who text while driving their cars are very dangerous, right? In that case, it's not so much about the act of driving as it is the act of people who are texting, and then we can make the point that they're dangerous. We start the sentence with texting, we end the sentence with dangerous, and the driving their cars is kind of buried in the middle. It's still there, but it's obviously the texting and the danger that we really want to focus on. Another example I have drawn from my own life. The other night I was texting my sister because I had a spider bite that was infected, and I could have texted her something like this. Can we talk? I have a medical question. It might be an emergency. Now, first of all, that's a bit formal for a text. It's perfectly fine, but it's formal. We don't text that way though, right? And the point is made, the question is asked, the reason is given, the punctuation is fine, but something that might be a little bit more creative for a text, and also might kind of give a little bit of my personality and be more appropriate for a text could look like this. Call me, I have a medical emergency question. And in this case, I've got like, hey, this is a little bit more urgent. Call me, exclamation point, kind of helps make that point. But then also I'm telling her like, this is a medical question and I'm concerned that it might be an emergency, but I'm not sure. And all of that information is encompassed simply in the use of punctuation in this case. The last example is a little bit long, but I want you to see it. So this is an excerpt from the first paragraph of Shirley Jackson's book, The Haunting of Hill House. So let's take a look. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed, by some, to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against the hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked, walked alone. I really like this sentence, and it's good for this time of, or this paragraph, and it's good for this time of year. But some of the things that we can notice syntactically that are going on are, first of all, I like this use of this phrase, and she does it a couple of times, but she inserts this not sane. It's like an extra breath, right? We're making this point about Hill House. It's a little awkward in its phrasing as it stands alone, but it helps to make this, it helps to draw us out and say, oh, Hill House, not sane. There's something wrong with this place, right? We've got this this kind of parallel structuring, right, within walls, bricks, floors, doors, and there's just this kind of like push forward with that parallel structuring, and that's a syntactical choice that she's making, and to describe the way that the house is being constructed. We also have these uses of semicolons to connect two sentences that don't necessarily need to be connected. Constantly, instead of putting a period there, she's putting semicolons. And what that does is that draws those sentences together. It draws them closer. It relates them in ways that if there were periods, they simply wouldn't be related. They would just be one sentence after another. And then finally, there's this last comma, and whatever walked, walked alone. And that kind of just gives that extra breath and emphasizes the loneliness of it, right? That last phrase, walked alone, kind of is brought out by the fact that we breathed there. And what we're left with is a paragraph that creates this kind of claustrophobic and uneasy feeling that just simply sitting down and writing, well, the house was there and it had walls and this and this and that. Like a lot of the syntactical choices that she's making are kind of forcing us to feel this uneasiness of the house because the sentences themselves are a bit uneasy in a way, and close, kind of jammed together because of those semicolons especially. So now that you have some background on syntax, let's see how you can do with some practice.